Eu sunt Maria, de la Vești Bune. Iar în urmă cu vreo câteva luni, împărtășisem cu tine ceea ce fusese o mare surpriză, dar și o mare bucurie. Pe atunci, ajunsesem printr-o întâmplare providențială în posesia celui mai recent roman al Georgiei Briggs și îți citisem și ție un fragment din el. Între timp, cartea a fost tradusă în limba română de către Editura Sophia cu titlul Bucuria Sfântului Serafim. Iar noi am avut prilejul de a o întâlni personal pe cea care a scris-o. În cele ce urmează, te invit să asculți un interviu plin de emoție cu Georgia Briggs, autoarea romanelor Icoana și Bucuria Sfântului Serafim, dar și a nuvelei Tu, ești, Casiana, din volumul 7 Sfinte, Seven Holy Women. Întrucât interviul este realizat integral în limba engleză, pe pagina acestui episod vei găsi și traducerea lui în limba română, cât și linkuri la fragmentele din romanele Georgiei pe care le-am citit anterior la Vești Bune, dacă cumva ți-e dor să le reasculți. Aș vrea să-ți spun și că în jurul minutului 20 vorbim cu Georgia despre finalul unuia dintre aceste două romane. Dacă nu le-ai citit și vrei să te bucuri de final doar așa cum a fost el scris, te rog să derulezi înregistrarea până pe la minutul 30. Dear all, we are here today with a very renowned American author, Georgia Briggs, who is well known to the Romanian public because of her first book published in Romania. In English, it bears the title Icon. In Romanian, it was translated as Icoana, o poveste despre puterea credinței. Georgia, welcome to Romania and welcome to Vești Bune podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's an honor actually for us, and we are truly happy that you have had this time and opportunity to come and meet with us.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
As I have said, the Romanian readers know you first and foremost because of the icon. And what or even who in the icon is Georgia Briggs?
Do you mean who? Am I like any of the characters? Is that what you're asking?
Well, what is the parallel between you and the icon? What made you begin write the icon?
Well, I originally based the main character, Hilary-Eufrosina, on my stepdaughter, who I was becoming very close to right after I was married and when I was writing the book. And she was just such a fun kid and so serious at times and just so eager to do things well and to learn, and very earnest little girl. And so I began the book because I was thinking of her with her in mind, and it just really made the book a lot easier to write and more enjoyable, because at every instance in the story I just had to think, well, what would my little girl do? What would this little girl do? And the book sort of wrote itself once I had that character in mind. And of course, Hilary-Eufrosina sort of took on a life of her own and grew into something that was not just my stepdaughter, but just kind of having that person in mind that I was becoming close to made it so much fun to write, because it felt like being close to her at the same time. Yeah, so she was really a big inspiration and something that I still think about when I read it. I still think about what she was like at that age, and she feels very close to me.
Last night, when we first met for the conference that you held, you have mentioned that you have written the book shortly after your baptism.
Yes.
In the Orthodox Church, we do not have very many tellings of what is it like for an adult to be baptized into any form of faith, especially the Orthodox faith. We only know from Saint Basil's writings about adult baptisms, Would you mind sharing a bit of your experience?
Yes. Wow, that's very strange. In our church, we're mostly a church of converts, and so many of us were baptized as adults, and probably over half of the baptisms at our church are adults being baptized. It can be a challenging experience for an adult because you're so much the focus of attention for that service. I think the closest thing maybe is being married. We're used to going to church and looking at the priest and looking at the chalice and the icons, but we're not used to being the focus of attention. So when you come in as an adult and you're the only one wearing a white robe and you sit down in this huge tub of water, and it can be very moving, but also a little bit frightening. I think I was very, very nervous, and I was just very glad to have it done with, to be honest. There's also a lot of spiritual opposition that you run into as an adult. I mean, perhaps there is for an infant too, but we wouldn't know because they're so young. But I think it's been the experience of most of us converts that the week of your baptism is just an incredibly difficult week. Everything that goes wrong, everything goes wrong that can go wrong. And many people have experienced family members or friends or people who they were close to coming up and being very negative and saying, you shouldn't do this is a terrible idea. And so that it can be a very challenging week. And then when you come out of the water, it's a bit like Pascha. You come up and it's done and it's new and it's clean and it's white and it's just lovely. I wish sometimes that I was born Orthodox, but I also am really glad to remember all of these things that many people who were raised Orthodox from birth don't remember being baptized or anything like that.
No, of course not, because as an infant you have no recollection of the moment itself. And the only things that, my generation doesn't even have photos from that particular moment, because we're talking about, in my case, about the 1980s, and families only took photos at certain times of their lives, so it wasn't
documented.
Yes, no, we don't have that. But my question referred especially to feelings and to your experience from that perspective, and thank you for sharing that with us, because, as you have said, quite unique. And I wasn't expecting you to associate it with a wedding moment, actually, but I'm happy that you have, because in a way we can understand what you've been through in this way.
Yeah, I was watching someone from my parish recently was married, and she was raised cradle Orthodox, Orthodox from birth. And so at her wedding, I thought, wow, this is the first time that she has ever been the focus of the church service. And how strange that must have been for her, because at my actual wedding, which was in the church, obviously, I sort of knew, how much focus would be on me already because I had just gone through it. I was just happy not to be, soaking in water this time. Right. It was a lot easier in some ways to get married and to get baptized. Yes.
Probably.
Yes.
I can only imagine.
Yes. Yes.
From this perspective. And from what I have read about you and from what you have mentioned, God for sure has granted you many, many talents. I know that you used to dance, you sing, you paint. What made you choose writing out of all these artistical paths?
Well, thank you, first of all. My family has always been a very artistic family. I think it's just kind of the culture of our family and how I grew up. My mother was an art teacher, and my mother was also a writer, a novelist. So I grew up seeing my mom's books come out, and, it seemed very possible that you could go and write a book and get it published and see your own name on the cover, which I think is something that most children don't experience probably. And my father is an English teacher, and so we were just raised on stories, my sister and I. He would tell us stories in the car, on car trips from Shakespeare and from all sorts of, medieval literature. He would tell us the Canterbury Tales stories. And frequently he would change the names and the endings so that later when I actually read the stories in high school, it was very disorienting because all of the, I thought so many stories had these nice happy endings. And then I would reach the end and realize, oh, this Shakespeare play is a tragedy. My father just changed the ending. But stories it's the way that my family spoke to each other. It's the things we shared. So whenever I'm processing something or really thinking deeply about something, I think that tends to be the way that I approach it, just because that's the way we grew up.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense, of course. I think there's a trail of clues in your books about this.
Yes.
If you just read into it a bit. And I think what drew me into the icon were, of course, Saint Nicholas, but also the genre of the book. It is dystopic, and you mentioned the fact about your father changing endings of books. Yours, for me, has a sort of an orthodox happy end, if I'm allowed to call it like that. Why have you approached such a controversial genre?
I think partly because it's what I was reading at the time. I had just gone through a phase of reading a lot of YA novels and a lot of books about dystopias and, kind of futuristic things, many of them with a very dark outlook on life. But I think in a way, Christianity is always acknowledging the reality of dystopia. We are always saying, the world is against us, and we're always looking for the coming of Christ and things coming to an end. We've been here for 2,000 years. Pretty much everyone in that 2,000 years has sort of been approaching life like this is the end. And it's true for us all as individuals. We're all in our own end times in some way. So it just seemed like a very interesting way to sort of unite what I had read in young adult fiction in American literature with kind of the outlook of orthodoxy and that ancient perspective of orthodoxy. It seemed like a very strange pairing, but it also made sense in a way. So it was just very fun for me to write because it was so different from anything that I had written before, but it was also such a fun discovery to see how those two sort of worldviews went with each other.
Yeah, it actually, what you were saying and what I was reading from the book made me think back at the early Christians and the fact that there is, I think, a parallel that can be drawn to early Christianity from your book. But since it is a dystopia, do you believe we're heading back there, or we never left early Christianity in a way?
I don't know that I could really say where we are going as a society. It seems very confusing. Some days it feels like everything is, heading in a very bad direction, and other days, especially when I'm home with my family and, out in the yard with my kids or with my friends, I feel like, the kingdom of God is at hand. Maybe it goes together. When I wrote the novel, it was before the pandemic, before a lot of the political upheaval and social upheaval in the United States. So I was more writing the book, not expecting any of that sort of thing to happen. And so it was a little bit crazy when a lot of the stuff did end up happening.
Yes.
And many people have asked me the question, do you feel like this is the future for us? And I have no idea, really. But I think it's a conceivable future, which, I wanted to make it plausible that these things could happen. But when I wrote it, I wasn't trying to make any statement about, this is where society is going. And several people have read it that way, which has been very strange because I wasn't trying to make that statement.
Yeah, what I mean, in Romania, we are currently experiencing what I believe to be one of our freest periods in terms of religious expression. We have religious education taught in schools as part of the national curriculum. People are free and more than allowed to go to church, and all cults, not just the Orthodox one, received very many rights, and they can build places of worship, they can build their churches, people can attend services. And I think for myself, as a modern Orthodox woman, I feel like I can manifest my faith in public and within the family as it has never been possible before, from what my parents and grandparents tell me about their Romanian experience. I think I have read your book from a different perspective, hence my question.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The United States and Romania definitely seem to be very different, sort of both in their past and where they're heading. I would say the United States is heading in a much more, I don't know if anti-Christian is the right word, but anti-religious, at least, direction, especially in public schools right now. You know, we're not permitted to pray at all. The teachers cannot pray with their students or share anything with their students. There's been a huge movement to remove, the 10 Commandments from public buildings and just get rid of kind of anything that would imply that the United States is a Christian country in any way, even though that is mostly our true history. We were founded by Christians.
Yes.
So seeing all those things, and there is sort of a movement against Christianity right now, it's easy to see how that could continue and sort of become an anti-Christian society. At the same time, there are many people, especially older people, who are very, very against that movement and very eager to keep prayer in schools, to keep God in the United States. So I think right now there's just a huge tension in the United States between those two groups. And I really don't know which way things will go. But I think in the next 20 years, we'll probably see what kind of nation we become.
A better one, God willing.
I hope so. Yeah.
Or at least one that still believes in Christ and holds
Right.
dear the Christian values, which I hope for our country as well, because one never knows what the future holds, of course.
True.
And going back to the icon, your dystopia relies mostly on names not being able to be Christian anymore. And a name carries so much meaning, and to know a person's true name is equivalent to knowing the deep magic from the dawn of times.
Yes.
For me, or at least that's what I associated, how I perceived this part of your book. Why have you named your main characters as such?
Well, I think I mostly chose Eufrosini's name because of, really I chose them because of the saints that are particularly precious to me. My husband's name in church is Eufrosinos, and so Eufrosinos the cook has always, held a special place in my heart. And his icon was one of the first icons I saw because I worked in a bakery and I didn't know that the owners were Orthodox. So I saw almost no icons, but I saw St. Eufrosinos every day. And his spirit is just so particularly humble and kind and so different from really many of the other saints. He was such a servant at heart, and he was so quiet and, even introverted that it seemed just kind of natural to insert him somewhere in my book. And so that became the name for Eufrosini. I also wanted her name to be something that was very unfamiliar to Americans because, it would make more sense that they were forcing her to change her name if her name was something overtly strange and religious to them. I also chose Mary for the librarian because of St. Mary of Egypt and her particular story. And, the backstory I have written in my head for Mary the librarian goes well with St. Mary of Egypt. So all of those names, I kind of pulled them from saints who were particularly special to me or people in real life who I wanted to put in the book in some way.
I think that's quite a good way to honor those who you cherish and you spend your time with. So
I hope so. I hope they don't mind that I put them in there.
Oh, I hope so myself. I know that you have continued your career as an author with a different book that has been recently published in a Romanian edition as well, The Fullness of Joy. And it starts with a motto from Madeleine L'Engle, and there's a lot of a wrinkle in time in the icon as well, about its safekeeping, about its reading, and I think it's one of the triggers in the book in a way or another. And have writing such a wrinkle in time or the Chronicles of Narnia or other writings as such influence you becoming an Orthodox? How do you perceive these books after your baptism?
They definitely played a part. And it's interesting because neither the Chronicles of Narnia or A Wrinkle in Time were written by Orthodox authors. But I think there's just a deep sense of sacrifice and of beauty and of mystery that runs through both of those books. And so those were the stories that I was raised on as a kid, and that was kind of the world that I was looking for. So when I didn't find it in the outside world, it really made sense when I arrived at Orthodoxy, and it really felt like the right place and the place that the Chronicles of Narnia had always been leading me to. Or, the place that somehow A Wrinkle in Time had been preparing me for, or The Lord of the Rings, or any of these books, most of them fantasy or science fiction, something imaginative, had always kind of instilled in me a deep longing for something that was unseen and beautiful and deeper than what I could find in the world kind of American society around me. So I would say those definitely played a huge part in my conversion, and they're still very dear to me, and I plan on sharing them with my kids because it's just part of how we arrived at where we are today.
Quite inspirational, I think, for all of us in terms of what we should encourage youngsters to read or to keep reading nowadays as well. And speaking of joy and your love of reading, would you mind sharing with us one of your dearest childhood memories?
Oh, sure. Let me think about that. Well, let's see. I already told you about my father telling us stories in the car.
Yeah.
So he created, I'll just tell you a little bit about this world he created. My sister loved pigs when we were kids. I'm not really sure why. I think just because they were pink. But he created this story, we would call it the snowball story, about these animals on a farm. And now that I look back, I think half of the animals were stolen from George Orwell's Animal Farm, and some of them were stolen from Walter Wangeren's The Book of the Dun Cow, if you've read that, and then the other ones came from Chanticleer and Pertalote, the old medieval hen and rooster. And so he wove for us this story of these animals that had gotten rid of their farmer and set up their own little, utopian society at this farm. And the story went on for so long, it probably was a couple years, and he would just make them up on the spot. I'm not really sure, maybe he was stealing from other material now that I'm thinking about it, but to us it seemed like he was making them up on the spot. So he would tell us the story whenever we got in the car, and it was just a really special thing that he did for us. And now I really appreciate, and my sister appreciates it too, and we have this sort of shared story in the back of our heads that no one else got. And he would do that in so many ways. So that's one of my favorite childhood memories.
He reworked things into a world of magic for his daughters.
He did. He was so creative. And, as a kid, I kind of assumed that was just the way that all parents were, because that's the way that my parents were. And now as an adult, I just realized how extremely lucky I was to have parents like that who were always telling stories and always creating things for us and encouraging us to create things.
Yeah, I believe that you truly were, because they invented several worlds for you to be able to draw your experiences from and your power from.
Absolutely, yeah.
And again about favorite. This time not your childhood memory, which we thank you for sharing with us. I, as a reader, have favorite parts in the books that I read. Do you, as a writer, have a favorite part in The Fullness of Joy, for example?
Oh, yes. Am I allowed to give spoilers here, or should I avoid spoilers?
Actually, my next line is kind of a spoiler, so...
We'll have a spoiler warning. If you haven't read the book, just fast forward until the end of this part of the conversation. Yes, I think I have many favorite parts parts that were my favorite to write, I suppose. But the moment that I feel most in that story is at the end of the book when Joy is granted speech for just one moment, and her only word is why. And that portion that I wrote was so personal to me because it's a question that I have been asking for the past few years, ever since I became a mother, and ever since I experienced all the joy and the hardship and the sort of the exposure of my own weaknesses and shortcomings. You know, it's a question that I've been wrestling with, just why. I didn't always know exactly what I meant by that question. But I think it helped me to write it through that book and have the bear ask the question, why? Like, why was I allowed to be with this wonderful person and to be such a negative influence in his life and take up so much of his time? And just having I know I wrote this, so it doesn't really make sense, but having the Mother of God say to her, for the fullness of joy, just was such a comfort to me, because to me that meant, not only for the joy of Saint Seraphim, but so that you would be filled because you were empty and God cared about you too, even though you were just a bear. So it just means a lot to me. I think writing that portion just allowed me to really express sort of the things I was thinking and work through them in a way that I couldn't do just looking at my own life without that framework of the story behind it.
Speaking of spoilers, in full disclosure, I think that was my most favorite part of Joy. Although I have liked a lot how you worked human feelings inside a bear, especially at the beginning of the book when she was struggling with the void inside of her and the darkness that kept surrounding her because of her pride and of her anger and of her envy of everybody around her. But that was definitely my favorite part, and it kind of brought me back. It echoed in me another passage from Sherry Shinoda's book this time, which I read, I think, about a year or two ago, The Light Keeper. And she has this character, the Light Keeper, fighting with another character, Wisdom, on an island, and because she doesn't understand why. This is a science fiction book, and her character is a fantasy book. She's propulsed in time to take care of one lighthouse and of another, and at one point she ends up on this island and asks Wisdom, why do I have to go through this fate? Why do I have to do this? And Wisdom doesn't particularly answer in words, but she hears the answer within herself. And the answer is for you.
Right. I think that, that's ultimately the answer. And it's a very humbling answer because we expect that we are going to be the one to come in and save the world and do things for everybody else and be the saint and the hero of our story. And then that doesn't work out and we feel like we've failed and we're terrible. But the whole reason that we're put in these places that we're put in by God is so that we can receive, his grace and his love in our life.
Yeah, definitely. And as I said, when I read the ending of the Icon, it marked me, and I think everybody who reads the Icon cannot move past the feelings that the ending leaves in them. And when I saw that you've switched genres with Joy, I didn't know what to expect. Yeah. I was expecting something real good because I especially like your style of writing and how you create imagery and instill feelings within the reader with the help of this imagery. But when I reached the end of Joy, I was perplexed again because you took me through a whirlwind of emotions, and it was like being inside a vortex of prayer this time. I know it's an oxymoronic thing that I'm saying right now, but it was like being inside especially when you've put the prayer in circle in your drawing, it drew me in. And at the end, when I reached your end, especially with this question, it was like, yeah, this is again an answer for me and for my searches and probably for everybody who will pick up the book and read it.
I really hope so. That's wonderful to hear.
It's quite an experience. And you've chosen for your first books, full books, wonderful wonder workers such as Saint Nicholas and Saint Seraphim of Sarov. And they are both two men and two extraordinary saints. I believe you've honored them in your books with what you have written. And yet there is also Saint Casiana.
Yeah.
And I have read in your podcast, together with my brother, I think at that time, the you are part of the story. But I have not disclosed to the people who listen to our podcast the reasons for you choosing Casiana for that piece of writing. Could you do that, please?
Sure. Well, the wonderful woman who put the book together and sort of got all these authors together to write a book, Melinda, she had a number of saints that she had already picked out, and she gave us the list and said, okay, you can, first come, first serve, pick the one that you want, and if you get it first, you can write it. And one of the ones I was familiar with was Saint Casiana. I knew a little bit about her, and most of what I knew was centered around her beautiful hymn that she wrote that we sing during Holy Week. And just the more I read about her, the more I related to her because, she wrote lots of things. She was a wonderful, very smart woman. And she also had a very strong personality, and it just really comes through in all of her stories. She's a bit feisty. She just got such a wonderful personality. And I kind of understood her in a way because I am not a woman that is great at being quiet or, many of the kind of more nurturing, traditional, maternal roles that women, I feel like, ideally would have. But I do like to write things and I like to sing, and sometimes I get in arguments with people I shouldn't get in arguments with, like she did. So reading the story of this woman who does not really sort of fit the typical maternal feeling of a saint, but still ended up being a mother abbess and being, just a wonderful woman saint. Reading her story and reading kind of her journey of how she ended up where she was, it was very comforting to me to say, okay, there's a place in Christianity for people who maybe argue too much or, say things off the cuff that they should not say, or, have these deep thoughts and want to write them down. Yeah, so that's why I picked her, and I think really that project helped me again work through some of the just sort of the passions that I have surrounding, my experience being a choir member, singing with a group of people and not being the main voice, and trying to do that in a godly way, and to be a woman in the church, but to still be kind of an outspoken type of person. Yeah, so she was a wonderful saint, and I'm really glad that I had a chance to write about her.
Yeah, all your characters, saints or not, like Hilary-Eufrosina or Joy, are curious, are brave, are a bit feisty, as you were saying, and I like that people can take a lot of courage themselves from reading both the novels and the short story about Casiana that you have written.
Good.
And to conclude our meeting of the day, I would like to end it with a question that I like asking all my interviewees for the podcast. If you could ask God to grant you a superpower,
wow.
What would that be?
Oh, man. That seems like a dangerous question. I always am afraid to ask for any sort of superpower because in stories it always seems to backfire on the person that asks, and they end up learning some sort of lesson in a terrible way. So, if I could have a guarantee that did not happen, something I really wish that I had was the power of not power, but the ability to have spiritual discernment to say, this thought is from God, this thought is not from God, because so many of the struggles that I have are from my own thoughts and from not knowing, is this from the Holy Spirit, or where is this coming from? Why am I having this thought? So I guess that's kind of a Sunday school answer, because it's not a great super, it's not like flying or super strength or something, but I think it would be very helpful to be able to know what's from God in the world, and so that you could head towards it, and what's not, so that you could avoid it. That's something I would appreciate having.
That's quite a superpower that you're asking for.
Yeah. I don't think many people, some people have had it, but I think mostly not. It's pretty rare.
Yeah, it's kind of like Saint Seraphim's
Yes.
superpower.
Yeah, only the saints, I think. Yeah.
May God grant you any superpower that He wishes to bestow upon you. I think that He's given you a great one with writing, because you're able to touch so many people with your writing. And I would like to thank you again for making the time to sit down and tell us a bit about how your books came into being, and about yourself as well, and your family. And
Thank you. This was so fun. These were such great questions too.
thank you. Se cuvine să mulțumim familiei Trifa și, cu precădere, domnului Alin Trifa, care a făcut posibil acest podcast. Întâlnirile noastre cu familia Briggs au fost doar despre bucurie și cu multă bucurie. Fiecare rând din romanele Georgiei are tot același subiect. Dar, când termini oricare dintre cărțile ei, pleci mai departe mai bun, mai curajos, mai dornic de a-l găsi pe Aslan. Mie nu-mi rămâne altceva de făcut decât să te îndemn să intri pe internet și să-ți comanzi cărțile ei. Iar când le-ai terminat de citit, să-mi scrii și mie care e părerea ta despre el. Până atunci, să ai multă bucurie, căci e cea mai serioasă îndeletnicire a cerului.